Hello biology buddies, welcome to lesson 2 from unit B1 cell biology. Today's title is Eukaryotes and Prokaryotes. I hope that you and your family and friends are well. This builds off of lesson 1, which was on animal and plant cells. For this lesson we're going to bring in a third type of cell, bacterial cells, which are going to be our example of prokaryotes. Let's take a look at what we are going to do today. We are going to recall what eukaryotes and prokaryotes are with examples. We are going to describe the structures found in prokaryotic cells, explain the function of those organelles, those structures in the cells, and then compare the structure of plant, animal, and bacterial cells. This mirrors in a lot of ways lesson 1, where we just talked about plant and animal cells, and that's intentional, so it will follow similar beats. We'll go through the organelles, we'll draw a diagram of a bacteria, we'll look at different ways of comparing them, and then we'll do a past paper question. You'll find in the folder with this lesson a set of past exam questions. The content covered in those past exam questions is from lesson 1 and lesson 2. So if you have a good understanding of plant, animal, and bacterial cells, their organelles, the way to draw them, the function of those organelles, you'll do really well on those questions. Let's begin. Bacterial cells. Bacteria are very, very, very different to plant and animal cells. The reason that they're very different is that they have different types of organelles, and they don't have some of the organelles that both plant and animal cells share. They're also incredibly small. If we were to count up all of the bacterial cells in your body and on your body right now and compare it to the number of animal cells or eukaryotic cells that there are in your body, you would find that it is overwhelmingly bacterial. So if we just went on a cell count, you are more bacteria than animal. Now, obviously, you don't look like a bacteria. I mean, I can't see you, but I'm assuming you don't look like a bacteria. And the reason for that is those bacterial cells are incredibly small compared to the animal cells that make up the rest of your body. But don't forget, bacteria is super important, and they are everywhere. In you, on you, all around you. It's going to be difficult to get away from bacterial cells. So let's look at some of the ways that they are different. The two that you really need to remember are that bacteria do not have a nucleus or a mitochondria. And for those of you who remember lesson 1, you'll be thinking, oh, if they don't have a nucleus, they must not have any DNA. Well, that's not entirely true. If they don't have a mitochondria, then that means they can't do aerobic respiration to release energy needed for the different things going on inside the cell. And again, that's not entirely true. One of the main reasons they don't have a mitochondria is actually larger than a typical bacterial cell. So it would be very difficult to fit one, let alone many of those, inside a bacterial cell. When we said that they still have DNA, that's entirely true. It just floats freely. So as the nucleus has a membrane, so it's essentially a separate container inside the cell in animal cells and plant cells that holds all the chromosomes, those long strands of DNA that contain the genes that are needed as the instructions for all the proteins that the organism has. Instead of having those contained in this bag, in this container inside the cell, it just floats freely in the cytoplasm. Bacteria do have some things that plant and animal cells have, and those include the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the ribosomes. The ribosomes are different in bacteria and plant and animal cells. You don't really need to get into that at all at GCSE. You just need to remember that bacteria have them. For those of you that are curious, it has to do with what the ribosomes are made out of. So we typically talk about prokaryote or bacterial ribosomes being 70S, whereas eukaryotic ones, plant and animal ones, are 80S. And you'll look at that in a little more detail probably in the first month or so of your first year of A-level biology. And then for those of you who choose to carry on with biology at university, you'll look at what that means in a little more detail. For the sake of GCSE, however, all we want to do is remember bacteria have ribosomes, plant cells have ribosomes, animal cells have ribosomes. So some organelles that bacteria have that plant and animal cells don't have. The first is that idea of the freely floating DNA, so it's not in a nucleus. It just floats around in the cytoplasm, and it's actually circular, whereas plant and animal chromosomes are not in a full circle. The bacterial one is in a circle. Plasmids are often confused with the freely floating DNA. They're different. They are also small rings of DNA, but they're much smaller, and they can actually be shared between different bacteria. Now, that's not something that you need to worry about until, again, you get to A-level biology and university, but it's really interesting that bacteria can actually share portions of their DNA, whereas we can't really do that very easily. So two bacteria that meet up together can share some DNA by forming a bridge between them and then sharing plasmid, whereas humans, if you high-five someone, you don't automatically get some of their genes. Be an interesting world if we did, but we don't. So these are the two that come up on the GCSE spec. I've put another two on here because you'll often see them in diagrams when people are talking about bacteria. It's not two of the things that you need to remember, so you want to focus on the first two. One of them is the capsule. Bacteria have a cell wall, just like plants do. Now, it's different in that, and again, this is beyond GCSE, plant cell walls are made of cellulose. You need to know that from Unit B4, Bioenergetics, when we talk about what plants use the glucose that they make through photosynthesis, whereas bacterial cell walls are made out of a compound called peptidoglycan. And again, that is beyond GCSE. It's just curious if you're wondering about how the cell walls of plant and bacterial cells are different. Some bacteria have yet another layer on top of that called the capsule. So they would have three layers: capsule, cell wall, cell membrane. And when people talk about antibiotics, one of the ways that antibiotics kill bacteria, and you learn about this a little bit in Unit B3, which is infection and response, is that those antibiotics can punch holes in the cell wall to kill the bacteria. So antibiotics are the drugs we use to kill bacteria and to inhibit or prevent their growth. Last but not least, we have the flagellum, which, if nothing else, is fun to say, and that is essentially a tail or whip-like structure on the bacteria. Not all bacteria have it, that they can spin, which allows the bacteria to swim. And I like to think of it as the prop on a motorboat. So the bit on a motorboat that sits underwater and spins, the flagellum operates in a similar way. The next thing we'll do is sketch what a bacteria might look like. There's lots and lots of different types of bacteria. You'll learn about this a little bit at A-level and then quite a bit more at university. If you do microbiology, bacteria can be classed on whether or not they are rod-shaped, spiral-shaped. There's all kinds of different ones. For those of you who saw lesson 1, you will know that I am more of a Remkant than a Rembrandt. That is a very, very funny art history joke, and if you didn't laugh, it means that you don't get it. So, yeah, don't expect great things with this diagram. We will start with the outline of the bacteria, and we will draw one with just a cell wall and no capsule to begin with, although I will add a flagellum on. There's my bacteria with my flagellum that is very poorly drawn. Inside, we are going to have the circular DNA, the free-floating DNA. And you can draw this however you like, as long as wherever you start, that's where you finish. So there is my free-floating DNA. I, of course, have the cytoplasm. I have the cell wall. Just underneath that, I will have the cell membrane. I'm going to have my ribosomes, which again are present in all three, plant, animal, and bacteria, but the ribosomes that are in bacteria are different, 70S versus 80S. And last but not least, I'm going to draw my plasmids, which are my small rings of DNA. If I wanted to draw a capsule, it would be another outer layer. Went a bit off over there. And there is a horrifically drawn bacteria, which is going to be our example of the prokaryotes. Speaking of prokaryotes and the word prokaryotes, prokaryota or prokaryotes are a type of domain, so a classification of life. You'll see in Unit B6 in the section on classification that it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, which is the classification system that we use to name all living things. Prokaryotes, for the sake of GCSE, all we need to remember about prokaryotes is that bacteria are an example of prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are going to have the same general structure that we did for the bacteria. They don't have mitochondria, they don't have a nucleus, and we compare those against eukaryotes, which include plants and animals. So when we say prokaryote, we're talking about a huge group, and within that group are all of the bacteria. And those bacteria have a lack of certain organelles and will have other organelles that plants and animals don't have within them. Contrast that with eukaryotes, as we said. Eukaryotes is another domain of life, and again, that comes up in Unit B6 at the end when we talk about classification. All eukaryotes are made up of eukaryotic cells, and those eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, they have mitochondria. Often what you'll see is something called membrane-bound organelles, and that just means any organelles, any structures within the cell that have that outer layer or that membrane around them. So the nucleus has a membrane around it, and inside of the nucleus is the DNA. The mitochondria, as we saw in Lesson 1, actually has two membranes, so an outer membrane and then an inner membrane. Learned quite a bit about that in Year 2, typically, of A-level biology, when you learn the basics of the biochemical pathways involved in aerobic respiration. So eukaryotic cells are bigger than prokaryotes. They have membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus, a mitochondria, whereas prokaryotes are smaller and don't have those things. If you remember from Lesson 1, we did a big table where we just put a tick for what the different types of cells, the organelles that they had in them. We're going to do a similar thing here. So our list is slightly bigger and we have one extra column for the prokaryotes, for the bacteria. So we have cell membranes, permanent vacuole, nucleus, plasmid, circular DNA, ribosome, mitochondria, cytoplasm, chloroplast, and cell wall. When we say circular DNA, we're referring to the free-floating DNA. So the big one, relatively speaking, that was inside the bacteria floating around in the cytoplasm. So either print out this page from the PowerPoint that's on the Teams site, or have a go at making it yourself. Don't just watch the YouTube, engage with it, please. It's going to make you remember things a lot better. I know last lesson I was thinking about putting music on. Spoiler, it's only been about 6 minutes since I recorded the last one, so I haven't actually looked for music anything yet. Maybe in the future, we'll see how we do. So just as an example, prokaryotes and both eukaryote examples that we need to know have cell membranes. So bacteria, animal cells, and plant cells have a cell membrane. Let's take a look at the rest. You can see how you did. So the only that has a permanent vacuole is the plant. Animal and plant cells have a nucleus, bacteria don't. Bacteria have a plasmid, animal and plant cells don't. Prokaryotes have that free-floating DNA, that's circular DNA. Eukaryotes, animal and plant cells don't. All of them have ribosomes, although again, your bacterial is 70S, whereas your animal and plant is 80S. You don't need to worry about that until A level. Prokaryotes don't have a mitochondria. Eukaryotes do have a mitochondria. We talked about how the mitochondria is actually too big to fit inside a bacteria. All three of them have cytoplasm. Only the plant cells have chloroplast, and then prokaryote, so bacteria and plant cells have a cell wall. But again, it's different. The cell wall in bacteria is made of peptidoglycan, whereas the cell wall in plants is made of cellulose. So that's one way that we looked at comparing them. Another way, slightly more visual for some people that they enjoy more, is the Venn diagram. So again, we talked about how to set these up in lesson 1. We have 3 circles. The first one in red there is for the animal cell, green is for the plant cell, and the black is for the bacteria or prokaryote cell. And where they overlap, those are the things they have in common, and then where they have something that the other two don't, you just put it in the main part of the circle. So things that they all have include cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and ribosomes, even though they are different. Plant cells have a permanent vacuole, as well as chloroplasts. Plant cells and animal cells share 2 structures that the bacteria don't have, the nucleus and the mitochondria. And then the bacteria have 2 structures we need to know that the animal and plant cells don't. And those are the plasmid, those small rings of DNA, and the free-floating circular DNA. Last but not least, the plant cell and the bacteria share something that the animal cell doesn't have, and that is the cell wall, although they are made out of different materials, so they are different. Okay. Hopefully your Venn diagram, if you drew one, looks similar to that, maybe a little bit neater than mine. Let's look then at a exam style question. Compare the structure of eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, 4 marks. So as always, we need to start by taking the question apart to make sure we don't write a brilliant answer to a different question. We want to write a brilliant answer to this question. So step 1, I'm going to look for the command word, and the command word is very obvious. It's the first word, compare. So compare again means similarities and differences. Don't just write about the differences, don't just write about the similarities. In the structure of eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, we want to make sure we talk about eukaryotic cells, we want to make sure we talk about prokaryotic cells. Now for eukaryotic cells, that's going to include our animal and plant cells, whereas our prokaryotic cells, we're going to use bacteria as our example. So 4 marks. We can do it in 2 sentences, just like we did last time. Begin our answer with the similarities. So prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells all have, we can look back at our Venn diagram for things that they have in common. Cell membrane, cytoplasm, ribosomes. So there is our similarities. There are our similarities, I should say. And then the differences. Prokaryotic cells do not have, and look back, what do they not have? They don't have the nucleus and the mitochondria there. We want to remember that it's asking us about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So while prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus or mitochondria, eukaryotic cells do. We could even add in, if we were a little bit worried, prokaryotic cells do have plasmids and free-floating DNA, while eukaryotes do not. You could talk about the fact that prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells, but these will get us the marks here. So we've talked about similarities, we've talked about differences, we have done a comparison. Let's look back then at our outcomes. Have we said what eukaryotes and prokaryotes are? Yes, we have. Eukaryotes are organisms made of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have nucleus and mitochondria, membrane-bound organelles, whereas prokaryotes, for example, bacteria, do not have a nucleus or mitochondria. Examples of eukaryotes, we had animals and plants. Example of prokaryote, we have bacteria. You'll see in Unit B3, there's a couple of other types of eukaryotes that come up when we talk about disease. So fungus is a type of eukaryote and a protist. So, for example, the organism that causes malaria is a protist. That comes up in Unit B3. Those are also examples of eukaryotes. But the big ones you need to know are the animals and plants. Describe the structures found in prokaryotic cells. We had new structures such as the plasmid and the circular or free-floating DNA. Function of the organelles is the similar as it is for eukaryotes. It has DNA, therefore it has coding regions or genes that are the instructions for making proteins. And then last but not least, compare the structure of plant, animal, and bacterial cells. We looked at that within the context of a table. We looked at how to do it in the context of a Venn diagram, and then how to answer an exam-style question using that. I have put past exam questions for you that cover the content from Unit 1 and, from Topic 1, Lesson 1, and Lesson 2. Please have a go at those. Next lesson, we're going to be moving on to specialized cells, and then we'll take a step back and talk about microscopes and look at some micrographs together and identify the parts, calculate magnification, and all that fun stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and I will speak with you soon. Bye-bye.